There are photographs, faded, yellowed, barely surviving in forgotten archives, of a mansion so vast, so impossibly grand, that when it was built, even the Vanderbilts stopped mid-conversation to stare. It stood on a hilltop overlooking the Hudson River like a crown that refused to be ignored. 100 rooms, marble imported from Italy, tapestries older than the Republic itself, a ballroom engineered to hold 500 guests beneath chandeliers that caught the light like falling stars. It was, without question, the grandest private residence ever constructed in the United States. And today, gone. Not renovated, not repurposed, not preserved as a museum or monument to American ambition, erased. The land where it stood is now occupied by ordinary apartment buildings. No plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary ever existed there. How does a palace, a home that costs more than most cities, vanish so completely from memory? How does a man who built an empire of steel and stone die forgotten in a modest apartment, his fortune obliterated, his legacy reduced to whispers? This is the story of America's Gilded Age at its most intoxicating and most tragic. It was an era when fortunes were minted overnight, when industrial titans believed prosperity was infinite, when wealth wasn't just accumulated, it was performed, displayed, weaponized. The new aristocracy didn't inherit their power, they seized it, and they wanted the world to see, so they built monuments to themselves, palaces that rivaled European royalty, estates designed not for comfort, but for domination, homes that screamed one message louder than any business deal ever could: I have arrived, and you will remember me. This mansion was the greatest of them all, but it was never meant to be a home. It was a declaration of war against obscurity, a fortress against the old money elite who refused to let him in, a monument to a man who believed he could outrun time, outlast his rivals, and build something so magnificent that history would have no choice but to bow. He was wrong. Within 2 decades of its completion, the mansion became a burden, then a ruin, then rubble, then nothing. And the man who built it, once celebrated, envied, feared, died alone, broke, and largely forgotten. This is not just the story of a house. It is the story of ambition that burned too bright, of a dream built too high, too fast, and with too much arrogance, of an empire that believed it was invincible until the world proved otherwise. This is the rise, the fall, and the disappearance of an American legend. This is the mansion that tried to outrun time. He was born into nothing. No inheritance, no connections, no advantage except the stubborn belief that America meant what it promised, that brilliance and sweat could rewrite destiny. His parents arrived at Ellis Island with little more than hope folded into their pockets. They spoke broken English. They worked brutal hours in jobs that ground men into dust, and they raised their son in cramped tenement rooms where the smell of factory smoke mixed with boiled cabbage and desperation. By 16, he was working on factory floors alongside men twice his age, operating machinery that could crush a hand in seconds. While other boys dreamed of escape, he studied the machines, watched how they moved, understood their weaknesses, and then he saw what no one else saw: a way to make them better. His first patent came at 19, a simple modification to steel manufacturing equipment that increased efficiency by nearly 20%. The factory owner laughed when the boy first presented it, then tested it, then offered to buy it outright. He refused. Instead, he licensed it, then used the money to file 3 more patents, then 10, then 20. By 25, he wasn't working for steel magnates anymore. He was becoming one. His inventions transformed American industry. His name appeared in newspapers alongside Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan. Investors lined up. Factories multiplied. Wealth poured in faster than he could spend it. But wealth, he quickly learned, was not the same as acceptance. The old money elite, the families whose fortunes were inherited, whose names were carved into the foundations of American society, looked at him the way one might look at mud tracked onto a Persian rug. New money, uncultured, a factory rat in a tailored suit. They let him into their buildings. They took his investments. They profited from his genius. But they did not invite him into their homes. He attended a gala once at the estate of a railroad baron. a man whose wealth he had long surpassed. The ballroom glittered, chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, women in silk gowns laughed behind gloved hands, men in tuxedos smoked cigars that cost more than a factory worker's monthly wage. He stood near the edge of the room, glass of champagne in hand, watching. No one spoke to him, not because they didn't know who he was, because they knew exactly who he was. The son of immigrants, the boy from the tenements, the man who still smelled of ambition instead of inheritance. He left early, walked out into the cold night air, looked back at the glowing mansion and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If they will not open their doors, I will build a palace that makes theirs look like servants' quarters. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even about wealth. It was about power. Proof. A monument that would force them to acknowledge what they refused to say aloud, that he had not just arrived, that he had surpassed them. So he began searching for land. Not just any land, a hilltop, a throne, a place where his estate would be visible for miles, impossible to ignore, undeniable in its grandeur. And when he found it, a sprawling expanse overlooking the Hudson River, perched above the valley like a crown waiting to be claimed, he bought it without hesitation. The architects he hired were the finest in the country. The budget he gave them had no ceiling. The vision he described made them pause, glance at each other, and wonder if he was serious. He was. "Build me something," he told them, "that will stand for 1,000 years. Something so magnificent that long after I'm gone, people will remember that I existed." They did. And for a brief, dazzling moment, it worked. Construction began on a Tuesday in April, and by Friday the entire valley was talking. Caravans of stone arrived daily, granite slabs from Vermont, pink marble from Tennessee, limestone from Indiana. Entire freight trains were chartered just to transport materials. Craftsmen were recruited from across Europe, Italian stone carvers, French ironworkers, German woodworkers who specialized in panels so intricate they looked like frozen lace. The architect's blueprints covered an entire wall, over 100 rooms, 11 bathrooms, a ballroom that could hold 500 guests, a library designed to rival university collections, a dining hall with a table that seated 40 beneath a ceiling painted to resemble a Renaissance masterpiece. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. The stone walls were 2 feet thick, built not just for beauty but to last centuries. The foundation went so deep that workers joked they'd strike oil before they hit bedrock. Windows were shipped from France, each one custom-made, some weighing over 300 pounds and requiring teams of men just to install. And the gardens. The gardens alone cost more than most estates in their entirety. Inspired by Versailles, they sprawled across acres of manicured lawns, sculpted hedges, fountains imported from Italian villas, and pathways lined with flowers that bloomed in carefully orchestrated sequences. Tulips in spring, roses in summer, chrysanthemums in fall, so that the estate was always draped in colour. A small army of gardeners worked year-round, 20 men just to maintain the lawns, another dozen to tend the greenhouses where orchids and exotic plants were cultivated in controlled environments. The flower budget alone exceeded what many families earned in a year. Inside, the grandeur reached levels that bordered on absurd. The grand staircase was carved from a single type of oak, imported naturally, and took 8 months to complete. Each step was a sculpture. The banister alone required 6 craftsmen working in shifts. The ballroom floor was inlaid with wood from 7 different countries, creating a pattern so complex that guests would stop mid-dance just to stare at their feet. Chandeliers hung like crystallized constellations. Some held over 1,000 pieces of hand-cut glass. They were lowered once a month for cleaning, a process that required pulleys, platforms, and an entire day's labour. Tapestries older than the United States itself lined the walls. Scenes of medieval hunts, Renaissance, gardens, biblical epics woven by hands that had been dust for centuries. He bought them at European auctions, outbidding museums and collectors who had families older than his country. The dining room featured a table so long it required servants stationed at intervals just to pass dishes efficiently. The ceiling above it was painted to depict the 4 seasons, each corner a masterpiece of colour and detail. Dinner guests would later say they spent more time looking up than at their plates. And then there were the modern marvels: central heating, a rarity in private homes, electricity throughout powered by the estate's own generator, an elevator, In 1906, in a private residence, hot and cold running water in every bathroom, a telephone system connecting different wings of the house, even a primitive intercom system so that he could summon staff without raising his voice. The estate wasn't just grand, it was a statement of technological dominance, a declaration that he wasn't merely rich, he was ahead. The local newspapers called it the Palace on the Hill. Society columnists described it as a monument to American ambition. Architects travelled from across the country just to photograph it, and when the estate finally opened its doors for the first grand ball, the guests arrived in a procession of carriages that stretched for half a mile. The Astors came, the Morgans, the Goulds, even the Vanderbilts, who had never acknowledged him before, sent representatives. Not out of friendship, but because refusing the invitation would have been an admission that his palace overshadowed theirs. The night was a symphony of excess. Champagne flowed from fountains. Orchestras played in 3 separate rooms. The ballroom glittered under the light of 1,000 candles and electric bulbs, a combination of old-world elegance and new-world power. Women in gowns worth small fortunes danced beneath ceilings that seemed to touch heaven. Men smoked cigars in wood-panelled libraries, surrounded by first-edition books they would never read. Laughter echoed through marble halls, and in the centre of it all, he stood. The boy from the tenements, the son of immigrants, the man they had refused to accept. Now the host of the grandest estate in America. For one perfect, shimmering night, he had everything he wanted. But perfection, as he would soon learn, is the most fragile thing a man can build. Because while champagne was poured and orchestras played and the elite danced through his palace, the world outside was already beginning to shift. Markets were tightening, empires were cracking, the age of the Titans was entering its twilight, and the mansion, glorious, impossible, magnificent, had become the heaviest thing he would ever carry. The first crack appeared 3 years after the grand opening. Not in the marble, not in the foundation, in the markets. Steel prices, which had soared for decades, began to falter. Foreign competition flooded in. Labour. Strikes shut down factories for weeks at a time. The political winds shifted. Progressive reformers targeted the industrial titans, painting them as villains in expensive suits who built empires on the backs of broken men. He had weathered storms before, but this time felt different. His investments, once untouchable, began to bleed. Companies that had printed money for years suddenly operated at losses. Debts mounted, partners grew nervous, creditors began asking uncomfortable questions, and every month the estate devoured more money. 20 gardeners, 30 household staff, maintenance crews working year-round, heating bills that could fund a small town, repairs on a building so massive that something was always cracking, leaking, or failing. What had once been a symbol of triumph became an anchor tied to his throat. He tried to cut costs, reduce staff, closed entire wings of the mansion, let parts of the garden grow wild. But it wasn't enough. His wife, who had once loved the estate, who had walked those gardens with pride and hosted dinners that made society columnists weep with envy, began spending more time in the upper rooms, away from the ballroom, away from the guests, away from him. She would sit by the window overlooking the Hudson, staring at the water for hours, her hands folded in her lap. When he asked what she was thinking, she would say nothing. Just turn back to the window. She knew what he refused to admit. The palace was killing him. His health deteriorated. The sleepless nights multiplied. His hair, once dark and thick, turned grey, seemingly overnight. He developed a persistent cough that doctors couldn't explain. Or perhaps didn't want to. Old allies distanced themselves. Invitations stopped arriving. The same people who had praised his genius now whispered about his decline, and still he refused to sell. "This house," he told his wife during one of their final arguments, "is all I have. It's proof that I mattered, that I existed. If I sell it, I've lost everything." She looked at him with eyes that had long since stopped hoping. "You lost everything the moment you finished building it." Then came 1929. The markets didn't just fall, they collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Banks closed, factories shut down. Men who had been millionaires on Monday were broke by Friday, some of them dead by their own hand before Sunday. His empire, already weakened, crumbled completely. investors fled, stocks became worthless, companies declared bankruptcy one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, and the estate, the magnificent, impossible palace that was supposed to last 1,000 years, became a mausoleum. He could no longer afford to heat it. Entire floors were abandoned. Dust settled on chandeliers that would never be cleaned again. Tapestries hung in rooms no one entered. The ballroom, which had once sparkled with 1,000 lights, sat dark and silent. The gardens, once manicured to perfection, became wild tangles of overgrown hedges and dying flowers. Fountains ran dry. Pathways disappeared beneath weeds. Staff left, one by one, as paychecks stopped coming. By the end, only a handful remained. Not out of loyalty to him, but because they had nowhere else to go. He wandered the empty halls at night, footsteps echoing off marble floors, past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets like corpses waiting for burial. Sometimes neighbours said you could hear music, faint, distant, as if the ghosts of old parties were still dancing in rooms that would never see guests again. His wife left quietly one autumn morning. No dramatic goodbye, no note. Just the sound of a car pulling away down the long, cracked driveway. He didn't try to stop her. He died 2 years later. Not in the mansion. He'd been forced to move into a modest apartment in the city, unable to afford even basic upkeep on the estate. The man who had built America's grandest palace died in 3 rented rooms with peeling wallpaper and a view of a brick wall. No obituary in the major papers. No funeral procession, no mention that he had once been one of the wealthiest men in the country, just a quiet notation in the death records. A name, a date, nothing more. And the mansion, his heirs wanted nothing to do with it. The taxes alone were crippling. Maintenance would have required a fortune no one had. It sat empty, decaying, a monument to a world that no longer existed. Developers circled. The city saw only the land. Valuable, exploitable, ready to be cleared. Within 5 years of his death, the decision was made. The palace would come down. The demolition crews arrived on a grey morning in March. 8 years to build, 8 weeks to destroy. They started with the gardens, ripping out hedges that had been sculpted for decades, bulldozing fountains that had cost fortunes, tearing up pathways where society's elite had once strolled in designer gowns and tailored suits. The flowers were crushed into mud. The statues were hauled away or shattered where they stood. Then came the mansion itself. Wrecking balls swung through walls 2 feet thick. Stone that had been imported from 3 countries crumbled into dust. The grand staircase, 8 months of carving, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, was demolished in an afternoon. Chandeliers crashed to the floor, crystal exploding like frozen fireworks. Tapestries, centuries old, were torn down and discarded. Some were saved by collectors who recognized their value. Most were thrown into dumpsters, rotting alongside broken furniture and shattered windows. The ballroom floor, inlaid with wood from 7 nations, was ripped up and burned. The library, thousands of books, some of them first editions, irreplaceable, was emptied in a day. A few were auctioned. The rest were sold by the pound to pulp mills. Windows that had taken teams of men to install were smashed with hammers. The painted ceilings, Renaissance-inspired masterpieces that had taken artists months to complete, were destroyed without ceremony. Room by room, floor by floor, the palace was reduced to rubble. Neighbours came to watch. Some took photographs. Others just stood in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing progress or sacrilege. By the time the crews finished, nothing remained but bare earth and scattered debris. The hilltop that had once held America's grandest estate was empty. Within months, developers moved in. Ordinary apartment buildings rose where the mansion had stood. Functional, affordable, unremarkable. No plaque was installed, no historical marker placed, no acknowledgment that anything extraordinary had ever existed on that land. The palace vanished as if it had never been, and with it, the memory of the man who built it. His name, once mentioned alongside Rockefeller and Carnegie, faded from conversation. Business schools stopped teaching his innovations. History books allocated him a footnote, if they mentioned him at all. The world moved on. New fortunes were made, new titans rose, new estates were built, though none quite as grand and none with quite the same tragic arc. Because America, for all its love of success stories, has an even greater talent for forgetting failure. The Gilded Age became a romantic memory. The tycoons who survived became legends, but the ones who fell, the ones whose empires crumbled, whose palaces were demolished, whose names were erased, they became cautionary tales whispered in business schools and then forgotten entirely. So why do we forget? Perhaps because remembering is uncomfortable. Because the story of a man who rose from nothing, built everything and lost it all forces us to confront an inconvenient truth. That wealth is not permanent. That power is not guaranteed. That even the grandest monuments, the ones built to last 1,000 years, can be erased in a generation. The mansion was not destroyed because it was ugly or poorly built. It was destroyed because it no longer fit the narrative, because the America that celebrated titans building palaces had become an America that resented them, because the dream he built of ambition rewarded, of genius recognized, of immigrant sons becoming kings had curdled into something darker. And so the palace came down, not with reverence, not with regret, with efficiency. But here is what remains. A handful of photographs, grainy and faded, tucked into historical archives that few people visit. A few newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, describing balls and gardens that no longer exist. And the story. The rise of a boy who refused to accept the limits placed on him. The creation of a palace so magnificent that even his enemies could not look away. The slow, inevitable collapse as the world changed and his fortune crumbled. And the erasure, swift, absolute, almost cruel in its completeness. Some rises are too spectacular to ignore. Some falls are too tragic to fully remember. But the lesson endures. Greatness is not measured by what you build. It is measured by what remains after you're gone. And sometimes what remains is only a story, a warning, a reminder that no matter how high you climb, how grand your palace, how certain your triumph, time comes for everything. Even empires built of stone. Today, if you visit the land where the mansion once stood, you will see apartment buildings. Ordinary lives unfolding in ordinary spaces. People who have no idea that beneath their feet once stood the grandest private residence in American history. No one remembers the balls, the champagne, the chandeliers. No one remembers the man who built it all, but the land remembers. Every stone, every brick, every dream that was buried when the wrecking balls swung. And somewhere in the archives the photographs remain, fading, but not yet gone. Some rises are too spectacular to ignore, and some falls too tragic to fully remember.